Hey, again, this is Sean Gerber with Reduce Cyber Risk, and now we're getting the PCI DSS Part 2. All right, part of the CISSP supplement of the stuff that I put out there for Reduce Cyber Risk, of helping you and your security company, your businesses, be more secure, along with helping security professionals understand security and assist in the CISSP. All right, let's get started. So as we talked about in the previous part of the PCI DSS aspects, one of the key components around that was how do we get there? How do we secure our network? We build our network, we secure our network, all of those aspects that go into protecting it. And then, so as we went through the different pieces and how you had to assess and how you remediate and how you had to go and comply with these different pieces with the PCI security standard, one of the aspects that came around this was to include security controls and building a secure network. Well, of that, the key aspect around that is what are some points that you need to put in place for your company. The first one that we're going to kind of get into is we're just going to roll through some of these security controls. There's about 12 of them that if you put these in place, this is kind of the crux, and that's probably not a really good word, the foundation of what you're going to need to do within your company from a business standpoint and from a security professional standpoint to ensure that you are meeting the PCI security standards. And these security controls, there's a litany of things you need to do besides just going, hey, I've got a firewall, I'm good. No, there's more to it than just that. But at the end of the day, this is where you begin this process at. So the first one we're going to get into is firewall protections to include wireless. Now, you need to understand that if you have the PCI DS or PCI payment card stuff, if you got payment cards that you're accepting, PCI DSS security standards are requiring you to have a firewall that are protecting to include wireless, that you would have a segregation of your network. So basically, you have an untrusted network segregated from your PCI environment, from your credit card information. And the purpose of that is to basically not have the blending of data. I saw one situation where I went out for dinner one time and went to a merchant to have dinner and was eating my food, and I looked in the back and they had a door that went all the way to the back, and you could see to the individual through the kitchen. And there was a computer, and this computer was it was a person that was sitting on there playing solitaire. And so I asked the cashier, I said, so what, that computer sitting in the back, so what is that? And they said, well, that's our computer that controls the store. I said, well, my credit card, is that going back there to that computer after you guys you accept my credit card information? He's like, oh yeah. And I said, so that person is playing solitaire on the same computer that my credit cards are going on to? Oh yeah. I said, does that thing have internet access? Oh yeah. Bad idea, right? So all of those things are just fraught with danger. Now, can you do that? Yeah, if there's ways to work around segregating those environments so that they're protected. But bottom line is that's just a really bad way of doing business. If you can't segregate this information, you now run the risk that you have all these 18-year-olds, and I don't mean this in a bad and degrading way, but you have 18-year-olds that really don't know much about anything because they're just getting started, right? They know a lot about their world, but when it comes to security, most of them don't have a clue. And so what's happening is you've got these 18-year-olds that are utilizing this information, and they're exposing your company, if you're a business owner, to risk. And so therefore, you need to put things in place to mitigate that risk. Now, again, if you decide that it's not a big deal and you're not too worried about it and you're just make money as fast as you can, great. But there's a good chance you could run yourself into some issues down the road where, one, you end up having a breach, you don't know what to do with it, and how do you handle that? So again, no direct public internet access to cardholder environment. This, again, would kind of fall that one tenet that I said where they had internet access on that same machine. You need to avoid that at all costs. Personal firewalls on computers. And that's coming down to it's what it really is do you have protections that are on those computers that are tied to the credit card information that are segregating this data from everybody else? In the old days where they had a personal firewall on the system, and in many cases Windows 10 has that already built into it, that's all automatic, but you need to have some level of segregation from those systems. And that's what they're wanting. They're wanting each individual device is separated from another device, and they do not allow an attacker or someone to get on the network to then just go pivot and move sideways within your environment. There's restrictions that are holding them back. So that's the purpose of that. But bottom line is, bottom line is that you need to look at what are some of the aspects around the firewalls and the individual protections. These could be hardware firewalls, this could be software firewalls, but do you have your network segregated? And do you not have wireless connected to it from a payment card standpoint? Second one is no default passwords. Now, default passwords are commonly searched for, and what you run into is most vendors, and I've seen this in multiple places, right? Vendors will come, and when they're setting up a product to ship it out the door, they will set up a default password. In the past, you'd have routers that would go out to the world, or wireless routers, and they would have the default password would typically be admin or something like that. And that the goal is to allow the individual the ability to go in and configure these systems in a timely and easy manner, right? You would go in with admin, make your changes, and then the goal is that you would change the username and password to something different rather than admin. Well, but we all know people are looking for the easiest way because they're always so time sacked. I mean, I run around like a crazy person most of the time, but it's what ends up happening is it's like, okay, yeah, admin, I'll get back to that. Okay, I'll get back to that. And they never get back to it. So the thing is you need to look for no default passwords. If you get a product that comes in, hopefully the vendor has created a way that it would not allow a default password. It's maybe a situation where the admin, and maybe the username might be admin, but the password is a randomly generated number that is not one and the same. We used to go online to, when we were looking at how to break into wireless routers, we would search online of what are the default passwords for a certain router or a certain switch, and you would find those, and they're online everywhere. And then the default router was admin monkey 2, something like that. And then you would use those, and you use that whole list of passwords hoping that somebody didn't go in and change it. Again, that's why the default passwords are so important, that you don't keep those on there. So as you're if you're a security professional and you're bringing in equipment, or you're a business owner and you're bringing in equipment and you're looking at what do I do? Well, you need to make sure that whatever password is there, you change it. Do not leave it default, even if they say it's a randomly generated password. Highly recommend that you change it to something that's unique to you. If you can change the username to something different, I would recommend that as well. The other thing to consider is storing all of these in some sort of password vault. I would recommend that, not just necessarily an Excel spreadsheet of some kind. But again, those are default passwords. They don't want those for within any device that you have. And it allows for quick access into the networks is well known. So we talked about that a bit. But bottom line, don't use default passwords, okay? That's security control number 2. Now, protecting stored cardholder data. This is something that's very valuable that you must go do, especially all these you have something that you have to consider. But if you are keeping stored data, this is imperative that you do this, because 1, it opens you up for liability if you don't. 2, it's just good business sense to do it. The first one is that you encrypt using industry algorithms. Okay, so don't go out and find the newest algorithm that Billy Bob Thornton, I don't know if he probably does algorithms or not. I don't know if he's still around. But anyway, Billy Bob comes in and says, I've created this new super duper algorithm on how to encrypt using Chicken Little 4672, and it uses quantum mechanics, and yeah, it's awesome. Okay, if you use that, you're setting yourself up for failure. Don't do that. Just say no. Utilize known algorithms that are currently in the market. Why? They've been beat on over and over to the point where they've found if there are vulnerabilities with those algorithms, they've been known and they've been fixed. If you go to pick something else out there that may be the best thing in the world, and it might be the most newest thing that's coming out, odds are high it's going to have issues. So stick with what is known. And most of this stuff is already built into the application that you may have purchased if you're a company, but just know that don't go with something that's got, hey, we got AES 56. That's a bad idea. You need to understand the newest and most current is around AES 256, something along those lines, the most current encryption algorithms that are out there and available. So stick with those. Do not go with something that is fly-by-night. If you are storing primary account numbers, these must not be stored unencrypted. And you need to understand your environment of how they're being stored. Do not just go and grab the data or okay, I got this machine. I'm going to plug it into my network. All right, I'm good. And you're assuming that the vendor that you're buying it from is going to take care of you. Now, I did see recently how there's companies that, you see people using iPads, and they have them instead of a register, a full-up register, they have these iPads that are collecting this credit card data, and it's on a little swivel. And I mean, I'll be honest, they look a little wonky, and they work just fine, but they seem wonky. Now, there's companies out there that are providing these that are built in more solid, more secure. They just look better. Same concept, same technology, but they're providing this for you. What it comes down to is if you get this as a vendor, as a merchant, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to put this in my business, don't just assume that it's correct. Ask the right questions. Again, these guys are big companies. They do this for a living. However, one thing I have learned is that the more times I ask questions about this stuff, the better off I am. So I always ask questions as it relates to protecting stored cardholder data. You just have to do it. Do not trust the vendor to do it their way. If it's your business and something goes bad and the credit card company comes down and says, you know what, you can no longer have this credit card data, well, that's bad, right? But if it takes you out of business, yeah, it's bad for the vendor because the vendor now they lost business, but you lose your business. So do not just make assumptions based on what the vendor is saying. Yeah, this is good. We're good to go. Ask the right questions. Know the information yourself, just to be properly prepared. Especially if it's your lifestyle and your livelihood, yeah, it's a wise idea to do. Okay, so as we're dealing with encrypting transmissions, now this is typically you need anything that's transmitted. So that was one of the controls, right? Protect the stored card data. Anything that's a PAN, encrypt it. The other one is encrypt transmissions. Now this is examples where data is sent. So if you're having data that's shipped away from you and sent someplace else, you need to make sure that it is encrypted when it's sent there. This is processors, third parties, backup servers, you name it. So if the data is being left from so you're collecting it at your location, at your hardware store, and as you collect it at your hardware store and you're shipping it to somewhere in Kansas, right, then you need to make sure that that data transmission is encrypted. Now, the documents that you get, if you're a business, you should explain that, yes, this data is encrypted while it's being transmitted. If it doesn't state that, you need to ask the vendor specifically and say, is this data encrypted? If you're a security professional, you need to understand how is it being protected and how is it being encrypted. That is an important aspect. And if you are having to file a report with the businesses, they're going to ask you specifically, or with the credit card companies, is the data transmission encrypted? And you have to be able to say, yes, it is, and you have to know why it is. So those are pieces that are in place that you must consider. Now, the one thing that I've got on there is processors and third parties. So sometimes there'll be one and the same. You may have a processor internally that may do that for you. You may have a third party that you outsource all of this information to. But one thing that people don't consider is your backup servers, right? So you have a system in place, you have a computer, and you take routine backups. Well, if you're backing up to the cloud, and let's just say it's using Google Drive or something like that, that transmission is encrypted. However, if you have one that's local within your environment and you're just backing up to a server that's sitting in your network, are you actually encrypting that transmission across the wire? So I have a box that I'm working on, and you know what? My backup server, this wouldn't be good. You'd want it in a different location. But let's just say it's in the same building. You know what? That computer over there in the corner, that's my backup server. Well, the data going from that computer, the one that's collecting the credit card information, to the backup server, is that encrypted? It better be. So those are pieces around from a security controls you need to be aware of. And again, these are just a small subset. I'd highly recommend you get in. I don't recommend, you need to, especially if you are a security professional doing this. You need to understand what are the network architecture and what are the minimum requirements. But bottom line is you need to encrypt your transmissions that are being sent from that device. Other security controls, we've got antivirus software. Now, this may be required to be installed on all systems connected to the network. So if you decide that you don't want to run AV by any way, then this should not be connected to the same network that you're running your credit card information from. So if you have any sort of credit card information running on any system, it needs to have antivirus installed. There's many vendors out there that provide this. There's also, if you're dealing with Windows 10, it's already built into it. There's a lot of products that can do this for you that can make your job very seamless. If you decide to work on old stuff, well, now you're incurring more vulnerabilities, but you'll have to ensure that there's antivirus running on those systems. Now, we've talked about reduced cyber risk multiple times. Antivirus, in some cases, a bit antiquated based on the old way of doing business. However, that all being said, it's still better than nothing. And what I highly recommend is you run new updated Windows 10 operating systems that will keep all of that for you and have it all built inside. Yeah, you don't have to worry about it. Also, the nice thing with like running Windows 10, there's BitLocker that's already native encryption that's set up within your computers, so that helps reduce your risk as well. So those are points that you need to be concerned about as an antivirus pieces. The other thing that comes into is any vendor that provides you software that are point of sale type of information, they need to have some sort of antivirus scanning as well. Now that needs to be in place. That needs to be defined in their documentation. You need to ask them that question of going, okay, well, you're providing me this software. How do I know that it's not having issues? Where is the antivirus? Does it need to be there? Now, I'll see some Windows, or I shouldn't say Windows, these new registers that are utilizing Apple iPads. And Apple does a really good job of segregating and keeping data secure. So in some cases, that may not be necessary because of the situation where they've more or less partitioned a lot of that risk off, so that if there's really not much of a way that some sort of malware can get into that environment. However, one of the questions you want to ask yourself though is how do they update? And that'll be one of the things we have on our next bullet is how do they update those systems? Are patches pushed to that device? If I have this point of sale device, how do I know it's going to be updated from any vulnerabilities that could be with the application that they've created? How do I make sure that someone doesn't install apps on there that are not approved? Those are pieces that should be happening. So back to the first bullet about antivirus, you need to make sure that the point of sale vendor has a plan around this. What are they doing? And ask those questions. Do not, I repeat, if this is your livelihood, do not assume that they are just going to take care of it. That's a bad assumption, because what will end up happening is they'll end up losing you, like I said before, they'll end up losing you as a customer, but you'll end up losing your livelihood. Not a good place to be. Update and patch systems. This is the next security control, and you should look at auto update. Can be useful, but beware. Auto updates can cause issues within your environment. You can patch the system and update the system, but realistically, that may be something you may or may not want to do right away. You may not want it to have it just do it automatically for you, because sometimes those updates will break things. And if they do break things, then you have to ask yourself, it maybe takes you down. So you have to understand, how do you want to handle that? Now, if it's a point of sale system and they're going to push an update, that's one question you want to ask the vendor. Are they going to automatically do that? Because one thing you don't want to have happen is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon they push an update that breaks your point of sale, and now you can't take orders. How does the vendor handle that? It would be very valuable to ask, just to understand, when do they push these updates. Now, I know as a business owner, you're probably going, I got so many other things to worry about. This is the last thing I want to deal with. Well, if you're a small business owner, you are the IT person. So guess what? Sucks to be you. You better figure it out. You don't want to be going and getting mad at your point of sale cash register when it's not working because somebody pushed out a patch to you and caused you to cause issues with you. Use updated and current operating systems. Again, we talked about this before. Don't use Windows XP. Don't use old stuff. And now even Windows 7 is going end of life, so don't use them. Update your stuff to Windows 10. Just do it right. Pay the money. It's not a lot, and it will keep you more secure and put you in a much better place. And at the end of it, it will keep your headaches to a lot less if you're trying to patch together a patchwork of all these little older systems trying to communicate with each other. Unless you're a geeky guy and you like to do that, or geeky gal and like to do that, great. But in most cases, that is, if you're running a business, you don't want to mess with that stuff. And also, they include any and all applications and devices. So this comes into patching as well of firewalls, your internet browser, your applications. That's Word, Excel, all of those. Are they being updated? And it's imperative that you consider that as a point, because everything from the device itself to the application all have updates that have to be done to them. And in many cases, those are the ones that are most often forgotten and left about, so which ends up incurs more risk for you and your company. Also need to restrict cardholder data to only need to know. This is role-based access controls. Now, this comes into is that if you've got the 18-year-old who's working in your environment, that person can only get access to, is only dealing with that, right? So those are role-based access controls. They have administrators and user accounts. These administrators, in a case of, let's say you have one person that wants to get access to your payment card area, That is the administrator account. Then you have user accounts. Well, you don't want your 18-year-old or your new hire to be accessing as an administrator unless you have controls in place. If you're the business owner, you'd probably want you or someone that you trust to be the administrator of that account. Now, that's you really want to break this in. You don't want everybody to have administrative rights. That just kind of goes without saying. But you need to consider that you put that in place so that these people can limit the access that they have. It's also required by PCI DSS 3.2 to maintain an up-to-date list. So when Bill is a user and then Bill leaves and you have Fred that comes in, you have to make a change to your list to ensure that Fred is now annotated on that list as a user. The purpose behind that is to have accountability. If in the event something happens, you now have somebody that you can go back to and say, yeah, Bill was the one that did that, or Fred's the one that did that, and we know that because he was working at this time. There was logs in place because of that. We know that that's the person who did it. That you have to have some level of accountability. So that's what they want you to do is when we're restricting cardholder data to only need to know. You also want to assign ID and passwords to individuals with computer access. There needs to be unique IDs and passwords to individuals who have access to the computer systems. Again, this is accountability. It needs to be unique and complex. You need to make sure that they are tied specifically to the individual and not to some random rogue account. Again, this comes back to maintaining, ensuring that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and you have the audit trail to go back and show that if something did happen bad, who did it? Why did they do it? Where are they at? When did they do it? All of those pieces have to come into play. No sticky notes. Don't put passwords next to your systems that are on a sticky note. Utilize again, like an online storage like LastPass, 1Password. There's other ones out there as well that can store these passwords for you. But in the case of that as well, don't let everybody have access to this password vault or database, because now you're just setting yourself up for more problems. You got to segregate this stuff out. So again, if you're a security professional, pay attention to that. This is not a joke. You got to keep these things separate and secure. If you do it right the first time and get people in a habit of using it the right way, you will make your life so much easier long term versus having to try to break bad habits that have been ingrained over time of having a sticky note underneath a keyboard and people just using that. So it's something to consider. Again, last security control there is assign ID and passwords. Okay, also we're dealing with security controls around restricting physical access. So when you're dealing with a workplace, one thing to consider is that when you're dealing with cardholder data, you need to ensure that you have restricted access of the data itself. So you need to keep the location secure. So if you have a credit card system that is sitting out there and it's open, you need to make sure that it's behind locked in an office. It could be in a situation where it's in a locked closet. Obviously, a data room would be better than anything else, but you have it segregated away from the general populace and also from your employees. So you need to keep that location secure. You don't want people having just direct access to it that don't need direct access to it. It also needs to be well lit and monitored. So in the case of an office, it would be highly recommended that you have a camera in there that's running and it's well lit, so to make sure that if anybody does have access to it, that you're watching what they're doing and avoiding anybody from potentially having access to the system itself. Don't let it be stored in open areas like we kind of talked about before, where you have a lot of people that are coming and going, especially employees. I've seen it where that these things are sitting in a break room and this computer's in the middle of the corner and then someone goes, well, what is that? Well, that's what we hold all our payment data on. That's a bad idea, right? If there's a lot of people that have access to that computer or availability for it, you need to have that taken care of and watched and monitored. Limit the applications and the use of the data. So again, if it's highly recommend it's a segregated system, completely independent with very few applications on that box completely. I mean, if you really want to avoid it, you may have a PDF viewer on there, you may have some Word on there, but at the end of the day, you really don't want to have much for applications that are sitting on that actual system itself. But again, keeping it away from people, keeping it away from individuals that have access to it, and limiting its access to a very small subset of people. Monitor it and watch it. Logging and monitoring, there also needs to be some level of logging and monitoring enabled on these systems. So in the event that someone potentially gets in there and breaks in, or from a hacker standpoint or any sort of data loss, you have some ability to go back and track that from an audit perspective. You must have that in place. And so I've seen it where in audits that individuals will say, yeah, we have logging and monitoring. We have the ability to determine if someone is working on it or not. Well, what ended up happening is they say, yeah, we have logs. Well, they have 1 day of logs. Well, that isn't useful. That isn't going to help you any. So they need to be enabled and they need to be reviewed. So just because you have them but you never look at them, well, what's the point, right? So you have to, it just can't be a checkbox saying, I've got logs, we're monitoring them, yes, but nobody's looking at them, no. Well, then how would you know if you had suspicious activity or not? You wouldn't. So it's really important that you focus on keeping this data and having some way of generating a report out of it. The nice thing is that if you have this, you can come up with just start off simple and straightforward. It'll be a whole lot easier that you can work through it. But again, keep it simple. Don't get overly complex, and it'll work out for you. But again, logging and monitoring and some level of auditing. Vulnerability scans, penetration tests. So vulnerability scans will look for issues externally to your website. So if you have a website and you do e-commerce off of that website and you fall within one of those, the quality or the security assessments, right? So if you're looking at different, not security assessments, based on the assessment questionnaires, the QSAs, if you look at that, or the SAQs, I should say, based on that SAQ, you may have to have an external scan done of your website. Well, these can be done quarterly by a scanning vendor, which can do that for you, and you'd pay for them to do that. There's multiple companies out there that provide this service, but they have to be certified by the Security Council on how they're going to handle that. And they have to basically meet a criteria on how they would scan and what kind of report they provide and so forth. But those vulnerability scans may need to be required depending upon your business and what your capabilities are. Now, penetration tests. Now, these scans just are focused on finding vulnerabilities with externally facing websites and externally facing presence. You have a penetration test, which does a deep dive into the weaknesses and will try to exploit that weakness. In a previous life, working as a commander of the Red Team, we would do penetration tests of military facilities and military assets. And we are looking specifically for the deep dive capability and what can I exploit. It wasn't trying to go broad brush. It was trying to find one exploit that I could then peel back and then drive deeper to what can I find out of it. It's a very targeted approach on how you handle exploits. You're looking at a specific event, a specific area, a specific server. I'm not trying to find a large group and then try to just scan them and then see what I can find. Typically, though, what ends up happening is you may start with a scan to find a specific vulnerable system, and then a penetration test would then drive deeper into that actual system. There are requirements based on the SAQ that you may have to do. And so based on that SAQ, you may have to have penetration tests done every so often. I know the service providers have to do this. They have to have it done at and I'm not sure the actual frequency, if it's twice a year, once a year. Typically, penetration tests are not an inexpensive event. They are kind of pricey. So I would be willing to bet that as long as you're doing the rest of the scans, the penetration tests are probably an annual type of event where you would do one a year on targeted systems. So you'd probably have, most likely these vendors are having to have an annual or quarterly scans that are done by a scanning vendor, but then have to do a penetration test that's done on a yearly basis. Documentation and risk assessments. Now, again, this is we talked about before. It's not just keeping some pieces of paper hanging out there. You must keep the documentation on your security practices in place. What are you doing for that? This includes policies, procedures, and evidence as well. The purpose of it is that in the event that something happens, you have to have the ability that you are taking this stuff seriously and that you're following what you say that they require you to do. So this is policies, procedures, evidence, all of that. That provides that capability or the understanding that you are paying attention to what the companies or the card holders, the card issuers are requiring you to do as part of the PCI DSS standards. You need to have examples of documentation. This would be, is it explained in employee manuals? Have you displayed to your, or informed your employees that they have to do this, that they're required to, you are a user or you're an administrator. These are the roles for administrator. These are the processes that an administrator must do. This is how often that you must have this done, so on and so forth. Are there policies in place that all employees know about, that are aware of them? Are there third-party agreements in place that you have talked about? And do you have those documentations in place with your vendors, especially as you're dealing with the security scans? Do they have that in place? Do you have your third-party payment processors? Do you have that in place where you've talked to them about their security standards and understanding that? Here's one that a lot of people don't deal with and they don't quite understand is, do you have an incident response plan in place ready to go? What does that mean? Well, an incident response plan is, do they have something in the event that there's a risk, though you have a break, you have a hack, and you've been informed maybe that there's been a hack. Do you have a process in place to deal with that hack? Who do you have the right people to contact? Do you have lawyers that you can communicate with? If you're not the owner of the company, do you have the owner's phone number on speed dial? Do you have public affairs? All of those aspects, how would you handle that? All of those aspects are detailed out in an incident response plan. And so therefore it's imperative that you have that kind of predefined and done already. And then you also recommend that you work through that with your employees, or at a minimum with the officers of your company, to ensure that everybody is connected with an incident in the event that something bad would happen. Finally, you have an annual risk assessment that you do, and this would identify any critical assets, threats, vulnerabilities that may be out there and set up for your company that you may be experiencing. So again, that must be accomplished as well. These can be very simple. They can be very straightforward. They don't have to be complex, depending upon the size of your company and your organization. But they help you to kind of restructure your brain around, what are the actual risks to my company, what is critical to me, and how do I best protect myself against any sort of threat that might be out there and posed against my individual business, and especially as it relates to the credit card industry and the PCI and DSS standards. All right, here's some of the references that we've brought up from this. It's PCI security standards. There's a whole bunch of great stuff out there on those. Security metrics, and also these are the compliance links for each of the credit card companies is included. All right, that's all the training I have for the PCI DSS. Hope you enjoyed this training. A lot of great stuff for you on reduced cyber risk, so check me out there. You can also check me out online at Twitter and also on LinkedIn. Hope you enjoyed this training, and this is more great stuff will be coming from Reduced Cyber Risk. All right, have a great day. Catch you on the flip side. See ya.